Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett. Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett.
Host of the Tony Kinnett Cast.
Let's get down to business.
You're listening to the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WYBC.
WCYTV
Here on the Daily Signal.
Good evening and welcome to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and first on 93 WYBC out of Indianapolis. It's good to be with you again here from the Holy Land in Israel. We've got a lot to get to. A ton happened today, including some pretty big news that no one seems to be talking about, at least a little bit less than they should. So the new inflation numbers for July are out. Let's just dig right in. It's 2.7 year over year increase. That's slightly below the 2.8% forecast. And right off the top of the bat, this should be notable to you because Chairman Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve had been suggesting that inflation is going to skyrocket. Inflation is going to skyrocket. That's why we're keeping the interest rates high. And we still have yet to see any of these major inflationary spikes from the tariffs. Now, they may come, but the more that we American people start to see the CPI get a little bit lower than was expected, it doesn't really make Powell look like a competent federal chairman. Even CNN, of all places, was forced to come to this conclusion on their coverage of it this morning. Check it out.
When you look at the key categories that we always look at, energy, food, and shelter, energy fell by 1.1%. That was largely driven because of gas prices falling in the month of July by 2.2%. Look at that food. I mean, this is where people spend their money, right? Food every single day. Food flat, 0%, and actually down at the grocery store by 0.1%. And then shelter, we always usually see an increase because that is what people are paying on rent, and we know that rents are rising.
Now, again, this is a considerable win for the Trump administration because now, for the fifth time out of the last 6 months, inflation has been lower than expected. As a reminder, Powell warned that tariffs would raise inflation and reminded and said he pinky promised that this was definitely going to happen. And it's really starting to look a little bit awkward.
And what we're waiting for to reduce rates is to understand what will happen with really the tariff inflation. And there's a lot of uncertainty about that. Every forecaster you can name who is a professional forecaster with adequate resources and forecasts for a living is forecasting pretty significant. Everyone that I know is forecasting a meaningful increase in inflation in coming months from tariffs because someone has to pay for the tariffs. And it will be someone in that chain that I mentioned between the manufacturer, the exporter, the importer, the retailer, ultimately somebody putting it into a good of some kind or just.
Now, there's a few things here with this that just don't really bear out. First of all, yes, it is understandable, it is 100% accurate to suggest that American consumers are likely to pay a big chunk of the tariffs. It is also true that there are importers that are choosing to eat the cost in order to maintain a heavier market share. It is also true that Americans simply are not buying inflated products. You may not be all gung-ho to get out there and get your imported avocados. That may not be something that Americans are willing to stomach. And again, there are also a lot of special contingencies for these tariffs as to whether or not, for example, as President Trump just demonstrated with regard to the Apple deal in Kentucky, tech companies and organizations that can justify themselves in the tech sector that are in the middle of increasing development in the United States are not going to have to pay the tariff. That's a very big deal considering how many industries around the world are, for example, like the automotive industry, are able to suggest they are part of the tech sector. And as long as they have either committed to or in the middle of increasing manufacturing capacity and development in the United States, tariffs aren't going to apply to them. Of course, the president has also paused a couple of tariffs around the world, especially with China. More negotiations are underway there. And then, of course, the president of the United States has a lot of the economic world talking, given a potential change in how the international markets are set up if the Russo-Ukrainian delegations are able to reach some kind of a peace deal. Trump heading to Alaska to meet with Putin on Friday. Is it going to bear any fruit? I have no idea. But at this point in time, the Trump administration is running on a lot of economic forced momentum that comes from the president wielding the levers of tariffs, for example, to get what it is that he wants. And speaking of getting what he wants, the fantastic economist. And then from the Heritage Foundation, good friend of the show, we've had him on several times. E.J. Antoni has been nominated by President Trump to run the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's the organization that puts out a ton of these reports. And I'm not going to get into a ton of speculation as to whether that's fantastic or that's the worst thing ever. Of course, it's not the worst thing ever. We love EJ. I do enjoy the Project 2025 rumors because EJ worked at the Heritage Foundation, and all that means that they're taking over the government. Ooh. I would love to point out that E.J. Antoni is independently recognized as a brilliant economist. And do you know why he's recognized as a brilliant economist? Number one, because he's often right. When you are an economist, you make predictions. In this line of work, I make predictions. One of the reasons that I would like to think, at least deep down in my good old Hoosier heart, that you tune into the show is because more often than not, I make predictions that bear accuracy, at least hopefully more than your average local weatherman. In the case of E.J. Antoni, the man makes accurate predictions. He's also not shy of criticizing President Trump, which shows yet another appointment, or in this case, a nomination by the Trump administration to put forward individuals who are not the yes men that perhaps he was putting in, at least on the surface level, in his first administration. So what you are seeing, again, is a very diverse group of individuals in this administration, and I think that EJ is going to be a pretty good fit for the job. As to whether or not he changes anything significant, that's where I'm going to close off any kind of speculation. But again, congratulations to EJ. I think he'll do an excellent job. Who's not doing an excellent job, because I'm so good at segues, that would be the Chief of Police in Washington, D.C., whom I can only describe as a very, very poor advertisement for the benefit of equity hires. So there was an argument during the entire late teens, early 20s Biden do-gooder social movement that suggested that right now the United States, and really for the entire history of the United States, has only been about promoting whites and men. Ooh, the worst kinds of people. And that's why all of the leadership positions in the country were fueled, run, led, etc. by white men, even though that's not true. Of course, there are disproportionately a lot of minority groups that have a sizable impact, especially based on the region you're in, again, based on demographics. But there was this argument that women were being put down, man, and black people were being put down, man, and a black woman could do just as good as a white man could to be a chief of police, for instance, in the Washington metropolitan area. And that's true. You absolutely can have women who are black or, again, brown, whatever the heck that means, to be in key leadership positions. We've seen it before. And usually what we see is when the right appoints an individual of a minority demographic or the other gender as is traditionally seen in fancy leadership governmental positions, usually it's based on merit. And so what you end up seeing is a class of abilities that comes from the individual's strengths and skills and wisdom developed over time through experience. That matters a whole lot more. Again, I remind you for the 815th time that Clarence Thomas is a fan favorite of the right on the Supreme Court, not because of the color of his skin, but because of how brilliant of a scholar he is. And not to mention, the prose of his Supreme Court decisions is fantastic. I mean, it's essentially like watching the worst high school Disney sitcom villain in high school getting slapped in the face by Topanga in Boy Meets World. It's just fantastic. Well, that's what Clarence Thomas opinions are all about. Now, the DC police chief was unable to explain what the chain of command would be now that President Trump has federalized the DC police, now that he's sending in the National Guard. And it's a really awkward moment for everyone because, again, as a chief of police, you're theoretically supposed to be able to come in and, say, well, now that I am no longer answering to Mayor Muriel Bowser, I'm answering to this other individual instead. Is that what happens? Absolutely not.
That's what the chain of command is now?
What does that mean?
Well, is it Pam Bondi speaking to the mayor, speaking to you, or how does this work?
So the executive order is clear. The president has requested MPD services, and our home rule charter outlines the process. The president designated Attorney General Bondi.
Now, I want to make this clear because, Bowser swoops in and starts saving the DC police chief. She asks immediately, so what is the chain of command now in the DC Metropolitan Police? Whom do you answer to? Again, a chain of command is a very basic term. It's not even terminology. It is just the structure of any organization, period. It is the most common of vernacular used in the English language in the Western world. And if you are the chief of police and you are asked, so what's the chain of command now? And you go, what's that? What do you mean, what's that? This is your job. Again, you make a very bad case for equity hires when you show yourself incompetent and unable to answer basic questions about the profession. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And this is a very low flame. It's like breaking a sweat in 60-degree weather. You can't answer what the chain of command is. I'm not asking you to map out DC's metro areas by heart. Just who are you answering to now? She doesn't know the answer because, again, she's expecting that Mayor Bowser is going to run in and save her bacon for doing a terrible job. Well, it's no longer Bowser's bacon to save, and so she starts, alluding to random parts of the Home Act and all this other nonsense that's, by the way, not going to hold in long term. And when the Supreme Court does eventually get involved, because if you haven't yet guessed that a federal judge is going to step in here and try to wrest control of the DC police from President Trump, I'm just letting you know that's going to happen. You are going to see someone in the Boasberg court who files some kind of an injunction saying Trump cannot run the federal police. It's not a thing. Again, the Congress and the executive branch own Washington, D.C. They are currently allowed to, they were allowed to run the security of the city and manage basic services because Congress had better things to do. Until it turned out that A, Congress did not have better things to do, and then B, the DC metropolitan area was horribly, horribly, horribly run. This is where we get to the humor, because what we have seen from the media is a complete inability, and I want to make this clear, a complete inability to cover DC crime whatsoever. So as a reminder, there was a high up official in the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department who was just canned for manipulating crime statistics. And that was reported by MSNBC and NBC News. That wasn't reported by, just Breitbart. Again, not that White Breitbart's reporting wouldn't have been any more inaccurate in that particular instance, because again, just being canned for falsifying data, kind of a big deal. Now, here's the fun. All of the leftist media goofballs and all of the just ridiculous clowns have now come out to try to suggest that Washington, D.C. is actually like the safest it's been in like 30 years. You have all of these goobers on major networks. You've got Donna Brazile, the former DNC mastermind, saying D.C. is my home. Violent crime in D.C. is down by over 25% from last year and at a record 30-year low. President Trump has become a master of distraction. Joe Walsh, Bruce Crossing, Brian Krasenstein, Morgan Cameron Ross, some goofball named Eleanor, who I believe Eleanor Norton is some kind of DC official. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares. These fools are trying to get out and suggest that DC is totally fine. I have walked the streets of Washington, D.C. in the last month. I saw men passed out from, if they were not yet overdosed, on their way to an overdose. I have seen corpses lying on the street as police were attending to a crime which had just been committed close to Union Station. Now, by the way, if you don't know, if you're not quite up to how Washington, D.C. is laid out, Union Station is pretty darn close. There's a small park between Union Station and the U.S. Capitol, which is right next to all of the House and Senate offices. And, Massachusetts Avenue, the Heritage Foundation and the Daily Signal offices, where I do, in fact, tend to swing by from time to time. And what I have noticed is that people don't enjoy wonderful, calm walks through the park in Washington, D.C. They have these artificial, weird orange light floodlight systems that try to illuminate the park. That's not enough to get people to stay in the parks in Washington, D.C. It's a hellhole. It's a terrible place to be. And the argument, crime is down. There are slightly less violent murders, but there are still representatives getting carjacked outside the U.S. Capitol. It's ridiculous. And the mayor of Washington, D.C. failed to act on it. But we'll get to that because I want to show at least that Morning Joe Scarborough over on MSNBC decided to air a comment because it isn't exactly unpopular even among party lines on the left. There are liberals in Washington, D.C. who understand, it's really, really, really dangerous and They're not totally angry at Trump for federalizing the Washington, D.C. police and then sending in the National Guard.
And I want to read you a text from someone who I won't say their name, but we'll just say that they're very liberal. And he says, this may sound controversial, but I'm not totally opposed to Trump's National Guard move in D.C. I know he's doing it for politics, but crime remains rampant. I've had too many friends carjacked, shot at. None of us will walk more than 3 blocks after 8 p.m. 13-year-olds are committing many of these crimes. Quite a change from a decade ago when things were much calmer. Well, that actually sounds like the D.C. that I lived in when I lived a block behind the Supreme Court.
Again, I've walked these particular streets in the evening. And no, they're not nice, lovable, fun places. That particular liberal is correct. They don't go out on the streets. And this is why things are funny, because there are New York Times goofballs who have made the case that actually, everything is totally fine. And you have people like John Gabriel Simonson, who have pointed out quite clearly that Politico writers, like Jonathan Martin, senior political columnist, says that, well, this isn't actually addressing crime. It's just Trump, chasing down his own voters. And, really, there's not any kind of data that suggests that it's as bad as in Cincinnati where people are beating each other. There isn't anything like that. Except Jonathan Martin is a Northern Virginia native who works out of an office in Roslyn. They're not in downtown Washington, D.C. All of these goofballs. There's a New York Times columnist that also tries to make the suggestion, well, actually, New York Washington, D.C. is really wonderful and it's fantastic and amazing. And he's never on the streets in Washington, D.C. Peter Baker, again, New York Times. New York Times and MSNBC. Citing a non-existent crime crisis, Trump plans to take over the Washington, D.C. police and put troops in the streets of our nation's capital. Contrary to his claims, violent crime in D.C. is at a 30-year low. I have never seen Peter Baker. No one has ever seen Peter Baker walking the streets of Washington, D.C. You're not going to see all these rich aristocrats moving around with the rest of the individuals that have to live with this crime crap. Again, that's why it's really funny that when they text in to Joe Scarborough, they're like, I'm tired of seeing so many of my friends, likely aides, staffers, representatives in Congress, carjacked, beaten by packs of roving 13-year-olds. It is wild how often I am reminded of excerpts from Robert Heinlein's novels where he describes the failure of these unlimited, no consequences, Democratic-run areas that were popularized during the 20th century, and they continue to fail today. Now, there was a moment later that I did think was particularly curious because the other kind of theme the left is trying to run with regarding Washington, D.C. is that, well, the only time that Washington, D.C. was dangerous was on January the 6th. Yeah, good luck with this.
I think it's really important to be clear about what is going on here. And a relatively small crime problem is being used for specific authoritarian purposes.
Relatively small crime problem. Yes, again, I want you to look at this individual. If you're listening to it, I just want you to picture a wealthy guy with overstyled hair in a suit and then the t-shirt, because you reach a certain point of wealth where you think you're all that, where you just start wearing t-shirts under your blazers instead of collared shirts like you're supposed to. And so this individual, I guarantee you, has never walked the streets of Washington, D.C. Or if he has, it was back in 92.
That we know and understand. So let's be clear about D.C. does have one really big crime problem, which was the January 6th insurrection incited by the current President of the United States. And his first act in coming back was pardoning all the people who tried to overturn constitutional republic order in Washington, D.C. When I go to D.C., I'm not afraid of losing my wallet so much as I'm afraid of losing my vote.
Sure. You know why you're not afraid of losing your wallet? Because you don't actually walk the streets of Washington, D.C. You don't. You have nothing at all, just because you exist somewhere. So I'll make this point very clear. I do not walk the streets of Indianapolis when I can help it. I don't. I do not, because they are not safe. I drive into Indianapolis and I park in a parking garage, or I park in a part of the city that is not a hellhole. Because I understand that if I get out at 38th and Post at 11 p.m., it's probably not very good for my health. The idea that the wealthiest of the wealthy are getting out and strutting at the 38th and Post Road of cities, Washington, D.C., perhaps the idea that you think the wealthiest of the wealthy are getting out and strutting around, I'm out there when I'm in D.C. because I don't waste money on Ubers eternally. And I have, up until this point, been able to take decent care of myself. I do try to limit the amount that I walk outside because it does get a little bit ugly. And Nancy Pelosi's also trying to jump on the January 6th thing. She says, Donald Trump delayed deploying the National Guard on January 6th when our capital was under a violent attack and lives were at stake. Now he's activating the DC Guard to distract from his incompetent mishandling of tariffs, healthcare, education, and immigration. Ah, yes, it's a distraction. Certainly we can't find hundreds of clips from the campaign of Trump saying, our beautiful capital is under siege by these miscreants, these ruffians, ragamuffins. And I mean, aside from the fact that Donald Trump has a list of synonyms for how 1920s individuals would call miscreants, I will say that the president has been very clear. He doesn't like the rampant crime problems in our nation's biggest cities. Shocker, the real estate mogul who has buildings in the biggest cities doesn't like crime in the biggest cities. Wow, amazing. I never would have guessed. Now, Chief Stephen Sund, formerly of the Capitol Police, said, ma'am, it's long past time to be honest with the American people, because he's not going to take this nonsense from Nancy Pelosi, who is futzing around on the deployment of the National Guard anymore. He says, on January 3rd, I requested National Guard assistance, but your Sergeant at Arms denied it. Under federal law 2, U.S. Code 1970, I was prohibited from calling them in without specific approval. That same day, Carol Corbin at the Pentagon offered National Guard support, but I was forced to decline because I lacked the legal authority. On January 6th, while the Capitol was under attack, and despite my repeated calls, your Sergeant at Arms again denied my urgent request for over 70 agonizing minutes, running it up the chain for your approval. When I needed assistance, it was denied. When it suited you, you offered fencing topped with concertina wire and surrounded the Capitol with thousands of armed National Guard troops. That is just objectively correct. There are several individuals who do have the authority to call in the National Guard. What we can see before January 6th is that Trump had originally suggested over 10,000 National Guard troops, and that was suggested I don't think that's necessary. And Nancy Pelosi, again, in this case, the Speaker of the House does in fact have to authorize requests for the National Guard. And in this particular instance, by the way, so to make this entirely clear, there are essentially two things that go into this. Number one, there needs to be an active emergency or situation that is going on to essentially just like break down, say, all right, we need the National Guard right now. If it is not an immediate who-boy situation, then you do have to go through a small series of procedures. Now, this is laid out really pretty clearly in the U.S. law surrounding this. But again, in this particular instance, we have on video Nancy Pelosi saying that, no, this is all on us. We're not actually going to be sending in the National Guard. And so for her to come out like other Democrats are and trying to say, oh, this is January 6th all over again, first of all, not going to go over well with Americans because you just don't care. And number two, it's not an effective way to make the argument that you think that you're making. Again, the same with gerrymandering. Democrats saying, you know what? I'm not really going to say that this situation is bad, but I'm just going to sit here and complain that I didn't get my way at some other time is really weird. It's really, really weird. And I don't think that American people, at least by the polling data, are going to buy into that long term. This brings us to my favorite story about long-term consequences. Adam Schiff of California is in some deep, deep, deep sludge. And the reason that Adam Schiff is in some very, very deep, deep, deep sludge is that last night for y'all, not last night for me, 2 nights ago for me, sort of, FBI Director Kash Patel released a declassified FBI memo revealing that a Democrat staffer who later turned whistleblower informed the Bureau of Investigation that in 2017, then Representative Adam Schiff had directed the leaking of classified information in order to damage President Trump. You are not allowed to do that. Now, this particular memo shows, and I'm not going to dig through kind of the B-roll and show it on screen. Please excuse me, it's a little difficult here on the road to get all the B-roll lined up in addition to the video clips. What we have found is that there was evidence on the books for a good long time that Schiff disseminated not just information that was probably false, that he knew was false in order to slander the President of the United States. At the very least, He's rocking a lovely libel and slander suit. Number two, he's violating some espionage laws. And number three, you cannot do that as a member of Congress. You can't selectively release information in order to create a false sense that undermines institutions of the United States. You're not allowed to do that. I really haven't been able to do that for a really long time. Essentially, it's the same as bearing false witness, kind of like a perjurous kind of situation. Only as a congressman, you're kind of always under oath for certain things. Again, I am not allowed to call the local police department and say, hey, there is a fire that is currently on the east end of town. You need to go check out that fire. I can see it burning from here. So the police and the fire department go deal with the fire on that end of town. And then on the other end of town, I rob the local CVS. You can't do that. It's not allowed. And it appears to be exactly what Schiff did. Now, I do want to point out that Steve Scalise did make a good amount of hay about this back in 2019, and it should have been taken rather seriously then. Steve Scalise was correct. And again, now that the investigation is basically charging freight train right towards Schiff, this stuff's going to get relevant again, and it's going to get real ugly for Schiff real quick. Check it out.
But I'm very concerned about what the chairman has done, and that is, and I'll yield in a moment. But he selectively put in a report the names of members of the press, of members of Congress, who he has had political disagreements with. He didn't put the names of everybody else in there. If he's got 3,500 pages of reports of phone records of people he's been spying on, he won't share all of those people that he's spying on, but he's selectively going to leak out names of members of the press who've written articles maybe that he disagrees with. That's frightening. That would be an abuse of power, but we don't know because the chairman won't share the details of what he's up to, but he did selectively put some of that in a report that wasn't even discussed in the hearings.
Yeah, that's a problem. That's a very big problem. Also, again, you can see Schiff in hearing making assertions. Again, this is a Democrat staffer, and we're now finding out that Schiff knew. And Schiff knew well. And again, here he is in a prior hearing suggesting we didn't even know who the whistleblower is. Yeah,
Some of my colleagues made the statement repeatedly that I've met with the whistleblower, that I know who the whistleblower is. It was false the first time they said it. It was false the second through 40th time they said it. It will be false the last time they say it.
Again, when you're the person leaking things and then you get caught, well, it just so turns out that your case that, well, I'm really not gonna, I don't even know anybody. I wasn't even there. In fact, I'm blind in my left eye. I can't see anything at all. Nope, not gonna work. It's really not gonna work. And here's one of the reasons why. Because in DC, Donald Trump has appointed Jeanine Pirro, and she is revved up and ready to go because she has taken on this investigation personally. And why has she taken this investigation on personally? Because it was a lot of us in the not left side of the media who were really frustrated during Russiagate. That even after investigations, even the cruddy investigations had come out and said that, yeah, there really isn't any evidence that Donald Trump had colluded with Putin. There's really nothing to suggest that Russia had desperately intervened on behalf of Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election. That didn't stop people like Adam Schiff from going out consistently, and making these claims anyway, suggesting he'd seen some kind of private data that made it all true.
In which the Russians offered help, which we know they did. The campaign accepted help, which we know they did. The Russians then delivered help, which we know they did.
There is circumstantial evidence of collusion.
The case is more than that, and I can't go into the particulars, but there is more than circumstantial evidence now. So,
you've said on more than one occasion that you've seen ample evidence of the Trump campaign's Russia collusion. Last March, you said you had more than circumstantial evidence of treasonous collusion with Russia.
I've certainly said that there's ample evidence of collusion.
Can you agree that there has been no evidence of collusion, coordination, or conspiracy that has been presented thus far between the Trump campaign and Russia?
No, I don't agree with that at all.
It goes on. The idea that he thinks that now that we now that it's confirmed that the Hillary Clinton campaign essentially not only funded this particular dossier and this Russiagate expose nonsense, and again, not falsifying information to the Justice Department, but then at the behest of, at the very worst, President Obama, at the very best, James Comey and John Brennan of the CIA, that they were going to falsify a series of articles. They were going to falsify a series of investigatory findings. They were going to falsify reports from the intelligence community, and essentially to pull attention away from the Hillary Clinton classified documents scandal, in order for there to be this narrative crafted that it was Russia pulling for Donald Trump. Now knowing that Russia deliberately kept damning information about Hillary Clinton, like her tranquilizer use and her emotional rages. Again, this is going to pan out in the long term, a good thing for Adam Schiff. I just don't see it. I do think that there is a lot of momentum in the Trump administration to finally go after some of these individuals, but doing so slowly. And again, though I am not often to do so, props to Benny Johnson for, in his interview with Jeanine Pirro, asking about it. Her answer, though, is exactly the kind of answer that I would want from an investigator. If I have someone that is investigating something at the federal level, if they are digging through for the possible bringing up of very serious charges of a sitting U.S. senator, she brings the right answer for it.
Adam Schiff, today, there was an FBI 302 that has now been declassified by Kash Patel. It's gone to Congress, and it's about Adam Schiff leaking classified information. It's a whistleblower from his office, and the documents are here and they're public. And Brett Tolman is saying, well, you listen, only the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. can make a decision on a case like this. And so my question is open-ended. Have you reviewed his documents? Are you familiar with the Adam Schiff's and the criminal conspiracy to leak against President Trump? Do you plan on investigating?
You know what, Benny? I think you know that this is my wheelhouse. And the difference between me and some other people is that I don't talk about what I'm investigating. I don't talk about what I'm doing. When I have the evidence, when I have enough to go forward, you will hear from me loud and clear.
So again, when I'm looking at this particular situation, I see individuals in the Trump administration who are thoroughly going through the entire investigation before they get out and start offering a bunch of Pam Bondi style Epstein file promises. If you go through and you say, I am going to be quiet until it is time to release the information, what you end up getting are results, because then people can't go hide things away and shuffle things behind closed doors, and you can actually pull a couple of surprise cards and get things done that it is that you want to accomplish for your administration and the American people. One of those things appears to be that Adam Schiff, according to documents released, believed that he would have been Hillary Clinton's choice to be CIA director had she won in 2016. It says, following the U.S. presidential election in November 2016, the mood within HPSCI was indescribable, said redacted. Ranking member Schiff was particularly upset, as he believed he would have been appointed as the director of the CIA had candidate Hillary Clinton won the election. The HPSCI minority viewed the election and its aftermath as a constitutional crisis, and by February 2017, redacted, stated that all hell broke loose. So what we're seeing in this particular instance is aggressive denial. You're seeing aggressive denial that did come with consequences, because Schiff decided to be the pony boy, to get up in front of the country and say a bunch of legally untrue things. Now we get to find out that through this investigation, how much did Schiff actually know and from whom? Because if he was that close, buddy-buddy, rubbing elbows with Hillary Clinton, then, well, were you at all involved in Russiagate? Again, whether or not the charges end up being something along what we would consider the moral, ethical, treasonous angle, like sedition or direct obstruction of the federal process, to be determined. But in the instance of Adam Schiff, he is in really deep trouble here. He's in very deep trouble here because he didn't just leave crumbs in a paper trail. The man broadcasted it like Broadway theater for several seasons in front of anyone who would listen. I mean, again, we saw the reel of him saying there's substantial evidence. I have the evidence. Here it is. And then he would leak things, and he would try to suggest stuff was there that absolutely wasn't. Well, that's totally, you can suggest things that are there that totally are not. That's not illegal. But when you start essentially using your powers as a chairman or as a member of Congress to change the course of events based on false information that you know is false, that's an abuse of power. And oh boy, they can get in some very sticky territory for, yes, even those in a Washington, D.C. court. This brings us up to kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about this evening, which is what is going on here in Israel. So I'm here with the Newsmax delegation. It's been a very, 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 very busy trip so far. Yesterday, at least, I should say earlier yesterday, we went to a series of museums. We spoke with a lot of families who were affected by October the 7th. We spent a lot of time talking with a couple of different diplomats, again, just kind of basic regional dive in your first day. Also, just for me, as a personal thing that I really enjoyed getting to visit a lot of the holy sites that I've looked forward to visiting my entire life. The Church of the Resurrection was excellent, as well as getting to see a lot of landmarks like the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives, and then, of course, the Pool of Salom, which is really cool because the road underneath Jerusalem from King Herod's day that Christ would have walked, they are currently excavating. It's not open to the public. They've recently just started the excavation. So it was a really incredible thing. I'll try to share some of the photos and some videos that I had of that particular excavation that has led to finally reaching the bottom of the real Pool of Salom, the one that in John chapter 9, Christ told the man who was blind to wash the mud that Christ had made and then put on the man's eyes. Here I'll little something that I did. Go wash in the Pool of Salom. Salom? Oh. The Pool of Salom. So really, really incredible. Not a lot of water there. No, a little sarcasm for me. It is really cool to see the results of very careful excavations of, again, just such beautiful history. It's amazing. I mean, it's amazing to me for a couple of reasons. Number one, the skill of stonemasons even thousands of years ago is just brilliant. I mean, it's just brilliant to see how much ancient architecture we got to see. For example, one of the columns of Tyre, which is referenced in 2 Samuel. Again, I'll get into this a little bit later. Today, however, we went down to the south. So we went down to the Gaza envelope. We went to one of the kibbutz. In English, it would be Oz in the Negev. It's the closest kibbutz or village to the Gaza city border. It's right next to it. And we got to talk with family survivors. What was really amazing to see is that while there is a lot of consensus on, while there is a fair amount of consensus about the anger about October the 7th and support for the Israeli military, the consensus for what comes next is non-existent. And that's very interesting to see. We got to talk with a lot of foreign ministry and officials, very, very excellent stuff. And then we actually did get to go out with the IDF and observe the border in the ongoing operations in Gaza. Here you go. Tony Kinnett with the Daily Signal. We're here outside the closest kibbutz to the Gaza Strip. Right behind me is the Israeli perimeter fence. And then, of course, the perimeter fence behind me into Gaza City. You can see the city in the wreckage and the rubble from here. The smell wafting over coming from the Mediterranean carries a lot of the stench that one might expect. Right now we're examining a couple of the lines, including the water pipes and the electricity lines that are running from Israel into Gaza. We did in fact confirm that the water is flowing from Israel into Gaza, as well as the electricity. There is aid being provided to Gaza, and it is definitely from the Israeli government. No UN here. Now, there's a couple of things that I wanted to bring up that I thought would be important on this particular trip. So first of all, I did want to look at some of the claims that have been made by international media that Israel is not sending aid into Gaza. I've seen it for myself. They are sending tons of aid into Gaza. I have seen next to no one from the UN. And I'm sorry, the UN sucks. We have seen secondary reports that the UN are refusing to take in aid because the IDF, who do not want UN semis to be, I think it's up like an 80% rate, that they are hijacked and then driven away, and who knows what happens to the individual who drives them in. But the IDF has been protecting certain things. There are artillery strikes that are continuing on. I have my suspicions based on some things that I've seen on social media this afternoon as to what particular targets of those were. I'm not going to speculate just yet. I didn't ask at the time because, we were at outside the Nova music festival when we began hearing the Nova Music Festival site and memorial, when we started hearing the poignant explosions that are synonymous with artillery. So an amazing trip so far. Again, the smell that did carry over the breeze that would come over the Mediterranean and then would carry through Gaza City and then to us, again, not very far away at all, at that wall, or not that wall, I should say, that fence, that second fence, it was very disturbing. Could very easily smell the blood, the sweat, the feces, and the death. For those who have had the unpleasant privilege of smelling such and understanding the frailty of human life and the devastation of war, and why those things should be taken very seriously. And that's why I describe that as a privilege. It has been an amazing trip so far. I will address one other thing. I have wandered away from my group several times to talk to individuals just throughout Israel. And in my wanderings, I have found 0 people who have treated me any worse the wear because I'm a Christian. And I have displayed it openly, all the way up into carrying my King James black goatskin Bible in my right hand. I mean, if I was wearing a white shirt, you'd think I was Mormon out on mission. But in this particular instance, in going around and talking to people, I described, that I was from the Midwest and that I grew up a Baptist, and, our particular views on eschatology and why I've always wanted to visit Israel. Every single person I spoke to, from the most orthodox with the curliest of hair and the fanciest of hats, to the secular Arab, to the secular Jew, to the religious Jew who wasn't in all of the garb, they welcomed me. They did. They every single one of them. Now, is all of that anecdotal? Absolutely. Of course it's anecdotal. But given that I see a lot of other people interviewing people for anecdotal interviews of individuals who haven't even lived in Israel for 20 years, and when they did, they lived in Bethlehem, in Judea and Samaria, which is a Palestinian area, the intense hatred towards Christians and the intense segregation. I believe that Reagan Reese, who is the White House correspondent for the Daily Caller, did get an email in from someone who watched the show saying, "Hey, just wanted Tony to know that my daughter is from over there, I believe, and they never experienced any segregation or anything like that either." I haven't. I've experienced lots of gratitude. When they find out that I'm an American, there is palpable thanks in the air. It's amazing how the left and the right over here want to talk about President Trump and how much they love him. Imagining, so President Herzog is a great example of this. So we sit down to meet with the president and his wife, and then Chris Reddy heading Newsmax doing a kind of a panel, and we're up near the front. And the comment was the weather, because it's been like 106, heat index is like 114, nice, lovely, scorching weather. I keep looking outside and expecting to hear kind of like the Hollywood, like, no, 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 like whenever you walk outside and it's just, the air is wavy. That's how hot it is. And the president commented that he thought it was due to climate change, because the dude is lefty when it comes to climate change. And the next sentence out of his mouth was praising President Trump. That's weird to hear. So a lot of people are very pro-America. There are a lot of Jews here from the United States who grew up in Oklahoma or Jersey. I mean, they are very, very fond of the United States. And I even had one individual who was an Orthodox Jew. And I'm talking the full getup, the overcoats, the undercoats, the fancy scarves, the curly hair, the felt hat. Poor man was probably sweltering in the heat, and was from Wisconsin and knew of the tiny Christian college, Maranatha Baptist University, that I went to for undergrad, and thought very highly of it. So again, just my anecdotes. I'll have probably further thoughts at the end of this week, but because we've gotten in a couple questions, I want to make it incredibly clear that I have been in a lot of places in the world in which I have felt very unwelcome as a Christian. Turkey would be one of them. I have never, ever, ever, in a place in which I am not the majority religion, in that instance, I have never been in a place where I have felt at the very, very worst indifference, in the way that you just treat someone indifferently, just they're a stranger. And then that's even rare, because the smiling and the nodding and the kindness generally towards people here, whether they be Jewish or Christian, or a couple of Sunni Muslims that I've run into. It's more akin to a diner in Newcastle, Indiana, at like 7:30 in the morning. Everyone's kind of comfortably sitting around and digging into breakfast, rather than what is portrayed by certain individuals on the international media and the podcast sphere who want to, I don't know, make you think that there's the boogie man that's out here to get Christians. I have not felt that even a smidgen. If that changes, I'll let you know. In the meantime, I'm not going to go through any kind of photos or things like that yet, just because this is also a podcast, and listening to me describe photos, I'm no Bob Ross. So me telling you there's just a little touch of aqua blue over here doesn't sound like the most exciting thing. So with that, I think we'll wrap things up. We'll see you tomorrow. Again, how long these shows are going to be this week, what we're going to be able to accomplish is a little bit uncertain, given some of the activities that our delegation is on that I can't reveal on the open air right now. So that said, pray for us as we're over here. The situation is not particularly safe, but there is a lot of work to be done, and we're going to make sure that when we come back, that we answer the questions that we came over here to get answered. So those things said, have a wonderful evening. Take care. This is the Tony Kinnett cast from Israel, from the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and first on 93 WIBC. Take care.